We've all got that pairing of wrestlers we've dreamed of seeing meet in the ring at some point. For current fans, it might have, up until recently, been Bryan Danielson versus Kazuchika Okada. And for some older fans back in the 90s, well, they were no doubt waiting to witness Hulk Hogan go up against Ric Flair. And thankfully, both of those bouts have since come to fruition. But what about those dream matches that could have happened, but for one reason or another, never took place? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with arguably the biggest of all, and that's Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Hulk Hogan. Yes, the biggest star of the Attitude Era and the biggest star of the Golden Era, the two men who, alongside The Rock, in many ways make up the holy trinity of wrestlers who became bigger than the business itself. It seems obvious that they'd clash at some point, but for some reason, they never did. Why was this? Well, the reason is known, as it's all down to Austin as it happened. After all, it was his decision to not do a match with the Hulkster at WrestleMania 18. That's right, this one came painfully close to taking place when Hogan, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash all rejoined WWE as the NWO in early 2002. But in the end, it was the Great One who got to fight the Real American instead, all while Stone Cold had to settle for battling Hall in the mid-card. What happened? Well, realizing how much of a politicker Terry Bollea was, Austin didn't trust him to do business correctly in the ring, and that was why he outright rejected a meeting between them at the Showcase of the Immortals. And to be fair, the way Hogan played the babyface and upstaged The Rock at Mania despite supposedly being the heel, maybe Steve had a point here. Could the match still have taken place at a later date though? Sadly, no, as by the time SummerSlam came around, Austin had walked out on the company in protest over his booking. And when he came back in early 2003, he only had one big match left in him, with this being his retirement bout against Dwayne Johnson himself at WrestleMania. That was until he returned at WrestleMania 38, of course, and gave Kevin Owens the best day ever. But not facing off against Hulk Hogan isn't the only dream match the Rattlesnake missed out on, because our next fantasy bout also qualifies for this category, and that's the one which would have seen him go one-on-one with CM Punk. Yes, if Stone Cold were to decide to come out of retirement once more, that is, this would be the battle between the two biggest anti-heroes of their times, the man who dominated WWF at the turn of the millennium, and the man who dropped a pipe bomb on the whole industry in 2011. Seriously, this one would be money, as Punk always felt like a modern-day answer to Steve Austin, someone who rebelled against the system and got fans on his side because of this. And with Candice Michelle Punk now having come home to WWE after years of being away, this would be the perfect opportunity for the bout to finally happen, if it was ever going to. Sure, as it stands right now, it looks like Punk is already tied up with Seth Rollins for WrestleMania 40 season, but who knows? There's always WrestleMania 41, providing Austin doesn't want to challenge Roman Reigns instead. Honestly though, despite Stone Cold looking pretty good in his bout against Kevin Owens, the reality is he's still a 59-year-old man at this point. So if it doesn't happen in the next couple of years, we're inclined to say this one will never take place either. And that's not the only still feasibly possible Steve Austin dream match which there's a good chance we'll never see happen. No, there is another. And like with Austin and Hogan, this one came painfully close to happening back in the early 2000s. What are we talking about this time? Why, his meeting with Bill Goldberg, of course. Yes, we missed out on this one by one day. That's how close we got. And the reason for that is because Goldberg literally debuted in New York the day after the six-time WWF champion retired. What a crime this was then, because back in the late 90s, Austin and Goldberg were like the yin to each other's yang. Two bald badasses who dressed in plain black gear and who were by far and away the top babyfaces of their respective promotions. Hell, it's even been suggested by former WCW booker Kevin Sullivan that part of the reason Bill got his initial push was because of his resemblance to the Rattlesnake. But if that was the case, then he certainly carved out a place of his own in the history books soon thereafter, as he at points threatened to become an even bigger star than his Texan counterpart. So when WCW was bought out by WWF in 2001 then, fans were salivating at the possibility of seeing the two finally square off in the ring. But as Bill decided not to go to WWF right away, it meant any hopes of this one would have to be put on hold. Still, most people expected it to happen eventually anyway. And that's why they were so disappointed when, 24 hours after Austin quietly hung up his boots at WrestleMania 19, Bret Hart's favorite wrestler decided that this was the time to make his big debut in Vince McMahon's company, with him instead going on to challenge The Rock. And sure, Rock vs. Goldberg was a big match too, but it wasn't as big as Austin vs. Goldberg would have been. No, that's one which would have been as era-defining as Hogan vs. Flair, if we're being honest. Would it have been as big as our next dream match, however? Who knows? Because if Hulk Hogan had ever gone one-on-one with the other face of WWE, who he most closely resembled, John Cena, then it might have been big enough to cause the whole industry to implode upon itself. And we're not saying there's necessarily a physical resemblance between the Hulkster and Big Match John here. No, well, both are big, muscular guys. Cena is relatively normal-looking, and Hogan has a much more larger-than-life appearance. That said, they are similar in character, and what makes them so similar in character is that unlike Steve Austin, they were pure white meat babyfaces, people designed to get young kids to watch as they always did the right thing and stood up for their core tenets of hustle, loyalty, respect, as well as prayers and vitamins respectively. So to see them clash and find out who the real hero to the children was would have been epic to say the least. Sadly though, this one would never happen. And the reason for that is because by the time Cena was really reaching his peak of overness in the mid-2000s, Hogan's hips had disintegrated into dust. Sure, he was still able to step into the ring on occasion against opponents such as Shawn Michaels and Randy Orton, but they were always far better workers than the West Newbury native, if we're being honest, so they could hide his limitations more easily. Of course, that's not the only reason we never saw this one though. No, there was another. And that reason was because by then, many adult males in the audience had already vocally started to turn on Big Match John. And if the face of the golden era could get himself cheered against The Rock despite going into that bout as the heel, then WWE no doubt feared the kind of reactions which would take place if the guy they were trying to position as the new face of their company faced off against such a force of nature one-on-one. Really, it could have been enough to kill Cena stone dead if things had been bad enough. And Vince McMahon absolutely didn't want that to happen. So instead, he chose to never book the bout, and considering one is now semi-retired and the other is being held together by nothing but wishes, the chances of us seeing it happen in the future are approximately nil. But maybe that's for the best, because putting the two in the ring today would likely see Hogan get booed out of the building instead, as his star has fallen in recent years. Two performers whose stars never fell, though, were people who the Hulkster squared off against multiple times throughout his in-ring career. That said, these two never faced off against each other, and that means fans never got to see the dream bout that was The Undertaker versus Sting. That's right, if anyone personified the spirit of WCW in the 90s, it was Sting. After all, he was the man who stood tall as its last bastion in the face of the NWO invasion. And he was also the one man who, for years after the company fell, outright refused to go work for Vince McMahon. Even today, in fact, he stands in competition to the WWE as a focused upon act in AEW. But if he was a representative of everything WWF wasn't, then The Undertaker was a representative of everything it was. Seriously, perhaps no performer in the history of the company has ever been as loyal to Vince McMahon as Mark Calaway has been. Even during their darkest days, in fact, he remained fighting on the front lines, always a Fed guy above all else. So it only made sense that fans would want to see a Taker versus Sting clash at some point then, as to them, it represented more than just a match. Hell, it was about two completely different philosophies colliding. And what would have made this even more interesting is that despite their differing outlooks, both were very alike in that they each had dark, gothic-inspired gimmicks, with The Undertaker being an undead high priest of evil, and Sting being a nightmarish protector who hid in the shadows. And as it happened, we almost got this on two separate occasions. First at WrestleMania 27, when WWE almost managed to sign the Icon after all those years, and then again when he actually did sign right in time for WrestleMania 31. Unfortunately though, the much anticipated showdown wouldn't occur at either of these shows. No, instead, Taker faced off against Triple H in 2011, and in 2015 it was The Game versus Sting, all while the Phenom challenged Bray Wyatt instead. Why had the clash everyone wanted to see not happened at the latter show? Well, it appears WWE didn't think it would be good enough at this stage in each man's respective careers. Of course, that excuse doesn't really hold much water, as the live audience in attendance would have eaten this one up even if all the pair could do was throw punches and kicks for 20 minutes. And with The Undertaker now retired and Sting preparing to hang up his boots too in March, we can safely say we'll never see the true battle of WWE versus WCW at this point. And another Undertaker match we'll never see is the next one on this video as it happens. That's right, it's time for us to talk about the one that got away for Golden Era fans, the Dead Man versus Andre the Giant. Now, to be fair, even if this one had taken place, it likely would have stunk out the joint, because by the time The Undertaker debuted at November 22nd, 1990's Survivor Series, Andre was barely mobile anymore. And that's because the gigantism which had made him as big as he was had taken such a toll on his body by then, he'd only live another 2 years. But just imagine if we could have seen this one when each man was at their peak. We're talking about 90s Taker versus 70s Andre here. Hell, even 2010's Mark Calloway, when he was having WrestleMania bangers every year, would have been a fantastic opponent for the Giant. After all, these were two of the most larger-than-life figures the industry has ever given us, so it would have been like seeing the irresistible force meeting the immovable object, something fans would have no doubt shelled out big money to witness. Sadly though, this is one which will have to remain in the category of what if, as there's simply no possibility of it occurring now, unless humanity figures out a way to raise the deceased without the whole thing turning into a Dawn of the Dead style situation. But at least we got as close as we ever could to seeing the Phenom versus the Giant when The Undertaker faced off against Andre's kayfabe son, The Big Show, numerous times throughout the 21st century. That said, there was no similar equivalent to be found for our next dream match, partially because when it comes to Shawn Michaels and Daniel Bryan, there's no one else who can compare to them. That's right, what you have here is arguably the best wrestler of the 90s and the modern day, a dream match any wrestling fan would give their right arm to witness. Had it ever taken place, in fact, there's a very high possibility that this would have been the greatest wrestling contest of all time, even better than anything put out by the likes of Steve Austin and Bret Hart, or Randy Savage and Ricky Steamboat. And what makes the fact that it never happened sting even more is that there was the perfect opportunity to do it back in 2013 when the American Dragon was en route towards taking over the entire industry. Why was this the right time? Well, it was when the Heartbreak Kid screwed Bryan out of the WWE title during his match against Randy Orton on October 27th Hell in a Cell pay-per-view. So with this representing Vince McMahon's attempts to push the Washington native out of the world title picture for the foreseeable future then, it made all the sense in the world to give him a dream match with which to rebound. But alas, perhaps the only thing which could have made fans accept the American Dragon not winning the gold at this point would not happen either, as back in 2013, HBK was still firmly committed to upholding the retirement stipulation from his match against The Undertaker at WrestleMania 26. Should he have broken it for such a bout, especially as he went on to break it a few years later in the infamous tag team match at Crown Jewel 2018? Probably, in hindsight. That said, at the time, he remained steadfast, and so all we got was Danielson putting Michaels in a label lock on the following episode of Raw, with this only serving to upset fans even more, and pushing them even further towards eventually taking over the show in their hero's name. Honestly, if there was one match in this video we wish we could have seen, this might have been the one. But it's not the only Shawn Michaels match we'd love to have witnessed, as there was another, one which very nearly took place back in the mid-2000s. What are we talking about this time? What else but HBK versus Eddie Guerrero. That's right, when Shawn Michaels returned to the ring in 2002 following a 4-year retirement, there were a lot of people fans wanted to see him go up against, performers such as Chris Jericho, Kurt Angle, Rey Mysterio, and even Chris Benoit. That said, arguably the biggest dream match of them all would have pitted the 4-time world champion against Latino Heat himself. And this is because you could have made a solid case for these two being the best in the world back then. Hell, Shawn's list of 5-star classics speaks for itself, and anyone who ever watched Eddie do his thing will know exactly what made him so special. After all, there's a reason why people still chant his name whenever someone breaks out a frog splash or a Three Amigos to this day. And to see him perform either of these on the Heartbreak Kid then, well, that would have been something to behold. And Vince McMahon was aware of this too, so that's why he'd originally booked the two to finally face off against one another at WrestleMania 22. Unfortunately though, mere months before that could happen, Eddie would tragically die of a heart attack, and because of this, any hopes of the showdown occurring would be lost forever. Yes, this one is particularly painful, as not only did we lose the El Paso native when he was still arguably at his peak, but we also missed out on an all-time great encounter, which we were so close to seeing. A match which had the potential to be so good, it could have been amongst the best ever, perhaps even better than the bout HBK had put on with Kurt Angle the year prior. Hell, it could have very easily been the best match of either man's career. That said, in terms of box office, there was one even bigger match Shawn missed out on, and this is the one which would have pitted him against The Rock. Now, we know that during the Great One's peak years between 1998 and 2002, the showstopper was largely absent as a severe back injury had forced him into early retirement. but there were still a few opportunities for such a bout to have taken place, such as in 1997 while the Great One was still on the rise. And if you think it wouldn't have been as big a deal back then, as Dwayne Johnson was yet to truly become the superstar he'd eventually become, there was always a chance to do it in 2002 or 2003 before The Rock departed for Hollywood entirely. Alas though, it appears there was never any hope of us seeing these two legends in the ring together, and the reason for that was because Rocky had absolutely no interest in doing such a thing. Yes, if online rumors are to be believed, early on in the Great One's career, Shawn Michaels had tried to hobble him before he could get properly started, as he saw the Anoa'i family member as being a threat to his position as the top dog of WWF. So because of this, once Dwayne Johnson reached his final form as one of the biggest stars in the industry's history, he made it clear to anyone who asked he never wanted to work with HBK on account of how terribly he'd been treated by him back during his early days. It didn't matter if there was plenty of money being left on the table, he didn't need that, as he was already a very wealthy man by then. Hell, he didn't need Shawn at all as far as he saw it. No, Shawn needed him instead. And the People's Champion had no interest in doing him any favors in the early to mid-2000s, as, if rumors are to be believed, he just didn't like HBK. So because of that, this was a dream match which will always remain a fantasy, and which will never take place, especially now as, even if the two were ever able to bury the hatchet, one is retired, and the other is probably only coming back for one more bout, and that's against Roman Reigns. But while the Great One versus the Tribal Chief seems likely to main event WrestleMania 40, there is still the outside possibility of another returning Hollywood star coming back to face off against one of the most imposing forces in the wrestling world today. In order to do that, however, WWE would have to first somehow reach an arrangement with Dave Batista, which saw him come out of retirement for long enough to square off against Brock Lesnar. Yes, of the four men who came out of the Ohio Valley Wrestling class of 2002, the only combination we've yet to see wrestle is the Beast and the Animal. Seriously, we've seen Brock and Cena multiple times, Cena and Orton even more times, and we've also witnessed the combinations of Cena versus Batista, Batista versus Orton, and Lesnar versus Orton too. But in all the years they've been active performers, we've never once seen Brock go one-on-one with Big Dave outside of one match in OVW before the pair became stars. In fact, one of the few times they were ever even in the ring together was on a random episode of Raw during the lead up to WrestleMania 30, and that was only a talking segment where the company briefly teased the idea that the match could one day take place. Of course, as we all know now, it never did, and given the fact Batista has quite a nice career going for himself in Hollywood, enough to where he said he'll never wrestle again, it likely never will at this point. What a miss this represents for WWE then, if that's the case, because it was such an obvious match to make and would have no doubt been hugely entertaining if each man had their working boots on. Sure, it might not have been as big of a dream match as some others in today's video, but for sheer star power alone, it would have been a must-see. It's easily something big enough to main event WrestleMania if it was built up right. But we can't always get what we want as wrestling fans, and this is a prime example of that fact, just as every other example we've looked at today also falls into this category. The category of what could have been if the stars had only aligned a little bit differently.